You wake up with an alarm, you check your phone, you have somewhere to be in an hour, and the day is already scheduled before it has even started. That is your life. But here is the thing. For almost all of human existence, none of that was true, and the real answer to how your ancestors actually spent their time is far stranger than you have been told. Most people assume ancient humans were constantly fighting for survival, hunting all day, running from predators, barely sleeping, clinging to life with dirty hands and empty stomachs. That image is everywhere. In movies, in textbooks, in the way people talk about the past. But that image is almost entirely wrong. Anthropologist Marshall Solins called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society, not because they had wealth, not because that they had comfort in the modern sense, but because they had something almost no one in the modern world actually has: enough time. Solins studied the data from multiple foraging societies in the 1960s and found that the average hunter-gatherer worked somewhere between 3 and 5 hours per day to meet all of their basic needs, 3 to 5 hours. Then they stopped. Not because they were lazy, because the work was done. Think about that for a moment. Your ancestors were not grinding from sunrise to sunset. They were not optimizing. They were not hustling. They were sitting, talking, resting, and they were doing it without guilt. So what did they actually do with the rest of the time? That question sat mostly unanswered for decades. Because studying the past is hard. You cannot watch someone who lived 40,000 years ago. You cannot interview them, but researchers found a workaround. They studied the last remaining foraging societies on Earth, groups like the Akungsan of the Kalahari Desert, the Hadza of Tanzania, and the Agta of the Philippines, and they used those observations to reconstruct what daily life likely looked like for most of human prehistory. What they found changes everything you think you know about human nature. The day typically started slowly, not with urgency, not with a to-do list. Your ancestors woke up when their bodies told them to, which, according to sleep researcher Jerome Siegel, who studied the Hadza and 2 other foraging groups, was usually around sunrise, after roughly 6 to 7 hours of sleep. No alarm, no snooze button, just light. Just the body doing what it was built to do. The morning hours were often the most productive. Small hunting parties, usually 2 to 5 men, would head out before the heat of the day. Women, often with children nearby, would move through a known foraging range gathering roots, berries, tubers, and nuts. This was not random wandering, it was deeply skilled work. The Kungsan could identify over 200 species of plants, knowing which ones were safe, which ones were seasonal, which ones had edible roots buried 3 feet underground. That knowledge took years to accumulate. It was the expertise of a lifetime passed down through careful observation and conversation. By midday in most climates, the heat made sustained movement uncomfortable. So they stopped, they came back, they ate, they talked, they rested in the shade. And here is the part that no one talks about. They spent enormous amounts of time just being together. Evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar, whose research on primate social bonding is foundational in the field, found that grooming, physical contact, storytelling, shared laughter, was the glue that held early human groups together. For other primates, that glue was literal grooming, picking insects from fur, cleaning wounds, sitting close. But as human groups grew larger, there was not enough time in the day to physically groom every individual you needed a social bond with. Language, Dunbar argues, became a kind of vocal grooming, talking, gossip, shared narrative. That is what kept groups cohesive. That is what built trust across larger numbers. So when your ancestors sat around in the afternoon and talked for hours, they were not wasting time. They were doing one of the most evolutionarily critical things a human being can do. The afternoon and evening had their own rhythms. Children played, and that play was not separated from adult life the way it is today. Children watched adults work, imitated them, learned by doing. There was no formal school, no curriculum. Learning was embedded in living. Developmental psychologist Peter Gray, who has spent decades studying the role of free play in human development, argues that this immersive, self-directed learning was the default mode of human childhood for hundreds of thousands of years. The modern classroom, by contrast, is a historical anomaly so recent it barely registers on the evolutionary timeline. As the sun dropped, the fire came, and the fire changed everything. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner spent years documenting fireside conversations among the Kungsan in Botswana. She recorded hundreds of hours of dialogue and analyzed what people actually talked about during the day versus what they talked about at night. The difference was striking. Daytime conversation was mostly practical, complaints, economic matters, food, conflicts. But nighttime conversation, firelight conversation, was almost entirely different. It was stories, it was mythology, it was speculation about distant people and places, it was imagination given sound. Wiessner published her findings and argued that firelight extended the social and cognitive day. Before fire, when the sun went down, activity stopped. After fire, and controlled fire appears in the human record at least 400,000 years ago. The evening became a second life, a mental space where the imagination could run, where culture was built, where the stories that explained the world were told and retold until they became shared belief. Your ancestors were not just surviving around that fire. They were creating, they were thinking, they were asking the same questions you ask. Why are we here? What happens when we die? What does that dream mean? The specific answers were different, but the asking was the same. Now here is the counterintuitive part. The part that should genuinely unsettle you. Research by economist John Quiggin and others comparing time use data across modern and foraging societies consistently finds that people in industrialized nations spend significantly more time engaged in obligatory work than their hunter-gatherer counterparts did. The 40-hour work week, which many people in the modern world exceed, would have seemed incomprehensible to your ancestors. They would not have understood the concept of doing the same task in the same place for 8 hours straight, 5 days in a row, for 40 years, for a number in a bank account. None of that maps onto the mental architecture that evolution built for you. And that mismatch has a cost. Rates of anxiety, loneliness, and burnout in the modern world are not random. They are not weaknesses. They are what happens when a brain shaped by 300,000 years of one kind of life is dropped into a completely different kind without any instructions. Your brain expected variety, movement, social contact spread across a full day, unstructured time, purposeful rest. It got open plan offices and notification badges instead. This is not a call to abandon modern life. It is not an argument that ancient times were better. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was devastating, disease moved through communities with no treatment available. No one is romanticizing that, but understanding what your brain was built for and what it still expects is not nostalgia. It is information you can actually use. You are allowed to rest without earning it. That is not a radical idea. It is the default setting of the species. For most of human history, rest was not a reward for productivity. It was simply part of the day. The guilt you feel when you sit still and do nothing is not ancient wisdom. It is a cultural message, recent and specific, layered over a brain that never needed it. You can sit with people and talk about nothing important. You are not wasting time. You are doing exactly what your brain was built to do, and what Dunbar's research confirms is essential to human well-being. Connection is not optional. It is structural, and when the day feels too long and too scheduled and too loud, when you feel that specific kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix, you might be feeling the distance between the life your brain expects and the life it actually has. That gap is real, and knowing it is, there's the first step toward closing it. So the next time you wonder why you feel scattered, overstretched, restless, or strangely empty despite